Valentin crossed the desert carrying in his arms the only reason he remained alive, his newborn daughter. After decades of hard work and invisible sacrifices, he believed he could finally rest in peace. But a brutal betrayal would tear him away from everything he had built and return him to a country he no longer recognized as his own. Today, you'll learn the true story of an immigrant who lost everything and still found a new home where he never imagined. Get ready, this story will touch your heart like few others can. If you enjoy interesting stories, tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. The heat was so brutal it seemed to melt skin. Valentin, with clothes sticking to his body like a dirty second skin, staggered forward. Each step on the burning sand was a silent plea. There was no shade, no relief. Only the precious weight of Alma, his newborn daughter, protected in his arms, like the last fragment of his humanity. Crossing the Sonoran desert was like signing a pact with death. He knew many left, but few arrived. Still, there he was, alone, widowed, with no compass but the immense love he felt for that tiny creature who could barely open her eyes. Behind him remained everything: the cheap wooden coffin where he had buried Lucia, his wife, the little house the wind had nearly knocked down, friends who could no longer help him even survive. The Mexico he left behind was nothing but an open wound that would not heal. His boots, bought at a second-hand market in Nogales, fell apart with each step, leaving his feet at the mercy of sharp stones and invisible thorns. Valentin ignored the pain. It was a minimal price compared to the future he imagined for Alma. A life of opportunities, clean schools, streets where bullets weren't fired at night. The coyote who was supposed to guide them had disappeared on the second day. He simply vanished during a sandstorm, taking with him the last bottle of water. Since then, Valentin walked alone, following the sun by day and the stars by night, when the cold froze to the bone. At times, he felt his mind playing tricks. He heard Lucia's laughter in the wind, smelled the aroma of homemade bread she used to bake on Sundays. Sometimes, he even saw his wife walking a few yards ahead, as if guiding him, refusing to leave him alone. He repeated to himself that he couldn't fall into delusions. He had to stay strong, for Alma, only for her. The little girl rarely cried. It was as if she understood with ancient wisdom that silence was a matter of life and death. When Valentin felt his legs might fail, he'd pull back a corner of the blanket to see her small, reddened face. Her tiny hands closed into fists. That restored the strength his body denied him. At night, Valentin sought depressions in the sand where he could shelter from the freezing wind. He lay down on the rough earth and hugged Alma under his torn jacket, using his own warmth to keep her alive. His stomach twisting with hunger, his throat dry as paper, his muscles burning, but his heart beating strong, stubborn and tirelessly. 3 days and 4 nights passed like this. On the horizon, at dawn on the 5th day, he spotted something different. Power poles, the ghostly silhouette of a highway, the United States. He felt his knees buckling, but he kept moving forward, one step, another, a million more. When he reached the roadside, cars sped by, indifferent to his misery. Valentin had no strength even to raise his arm. He knelt on the hot asphalt, hugging Alma against his chest, and closed his eyes, murmuring a jumbled prayer. "Holy Mother, don't abandon me now." An old, rusty truck braked suddenly a few yards away. A man with a weathered face and wary eyes got out. He approached slowly, like someone approaching an injured animal. Valentin barely raised his head, showing him Alma, and the stranger's heart broke a little. "Get in, friend," the man said in heavily accented Spanish. He didn't ask for names. He didn't ask for papers. He just helped them into the cab and offered a bottle of water hot as hell, but to Valentin it was blessed nectar. He took a sip, moistened Alma's cracked lips, and then closed his eyes for the first time in days. He woke up in a small, forgotten town in South Texas. Prefabricated houses, streets without sidewalks, dusty stores. No one seemed to care where he came from or where he was going. It was perfect. A Salvadoran family took him in for the first few nights. Valentin could barely walk, but his mind was focused. He needed to find work, a safe shelter for his daughter. Without papers, without English, he knew his fate would be dirty work, the kind no one wanted to do. And that was fine. He didn't ask for more. Soon, he rented a miserable basement in exchange for cleaning the backyard of an elderly Mexican woman. It was dark, damp, smelled of mold and hopelessness, but it had 4 walls, a roof, and most importantly, it was out of the sight of La Migra. There, in that hole forgotten by the world, Valentin planted the seed of his new life. He raised Alma with silent devotion, learning to move in the shadows, to avoid questions, to live clandestinely. Every penny he earned hauling trash or cleaning public bathrooms, he saved for his daughter's future, eating barely enough to survive, wearing the same clothes until the seams came apart. The nights were long. Valentin spent them sitting in a broken chair, watching Alma sleep in a cardboard box lined with blankets. Sometimes, tears blurred his vision, but he never let them fall. He couldn't afford the luxury of sadness. There would be time for crying later. Now, there was only survival. The sun beat down mercilessly on the small South Texas town, one of those that doesn't even appear on maps. The streets were dirt, dust stuck to skin like a second layer, and the air always smelled of sweat and exhaustion. Valentin walked those streets every morning, head down, heart full of fears, and will hardened by necessity. Finding work without papers was a dirty art, a dance of silences and evasive glances. He knew he had to accept whatever came his way, and soon understood it in the crudest form. His first job was cleaning a backyard infested with debris under a heat that melted the soul for just $20. He did it without asking questions, without complaining. It was a fair price, he thought, if it meant being able to return home with a little milk for Alma. In those first months, Valentin became invisible. To legal residents, he was barely a shadow passing by, pushing a cart of rusty tools. To other undocumented immigrants, he was a fellow in misfortune, one more in the endless line of cheap hands and quiet voices. He quickly learned that in this world, solidarity didn't exist. Everyone fought for their own survival, and kindness was a luxury no one could afford. The basement where he lived was a dark hole that barely protected from the cold nights or the midday heat. An old mattress, rescued from the trash, was the bed he shared with Alma. Each night, he made sure to check the place for cockroaches or rats before laying her down. And every morning, when leaving for work, he left her with Doña Carmen, a Salvadoran woman, who lived in the building and cared for other migrants' children for a few coins. Life was a chain of sacrifices. Valentin didn't know the word rest. During the day, he carried bricks at illegal construction sites, took out trash from restaurants that preferred not to ask for papers, or cleaned public bathrooms where the stench was so strong it remained ingrained in his skin for hours. At night, he scrubbed floors at a gas station by the highway, receiving crumpled bills as payment. Bills he kept with almost religious love in an old cookie tin hidden under the mattress. Every penny had a destination: diapers, milk, used clothes for Alma, and a little food for himself. He got used to skipping meals, stretching a can of beans over 3 days, mending his only shirt until the fabric could no longer hold. He did it without resentment. In his mind, the image of Alma, healthy and happy, was worth all these sacrifices. Sundays were the only days he could spend entirely with his daughter. He would take her out wrapped in a small blanket, walking dusty streets to the rundown neighborhood park. Valentin would sit on a rusty bench while Alma played on a broken swing under a sky that sometimes seemed as distant as his own dreams. There, between his daughter's shy laughter and the smell of street tacos, he found reasons to keep breathing. Little by little, Valentine began to understand loose words in English. The bosses didn't speak to him directly. They shouted quick orders that he had to interpret on the fly. A hurry up or a move it was all he received. He also learned that a servile smile could save him from being replaced the next day, that silencing injustices was part of the unwritten deal of being illegal in a foreign land. There were nights when Valentine came to the basement with his hands raw, fingernails black with dirt, his body so exhausted he could barely hold Alma in his arms. Still, he told her stories. Made-up stories full of castles and princesses where good always triumphed and misery never existed. He didn't want his daughter to grow up believing that life was just work and pain. Some days Valentine daydreamed. He imagined Alma dressed in a school uniform with new backpacks, laughing without fear, without the weight of a foreign last name. He saw himself, grown old, sitting in the bleachers watching his daughter graduate, crying with pride. It was that invisible future that sustained each of his steps. There were times when he thought of giving up. There were mornings when his body wouldn't respond, when loneliness and nostalgia attacked him with brutal violence. He thought of Lucia, her sweet voice, her way of holding his hand to tell him everything would be all right. But she was gone. Only he remained, and Alma. Time passed in repetitive cycles of hunger, sweat, and silent hopes. Valentine never allowed himself to spend on himself. Not a new shirt, not a decent pair of shoes. Everything was for Alma, everything. Each dollar earned was a promise. You won't lack anything, my daughter, even if I'm left without a soul in the attempt. On the outside, he was a hunched man dressed in rags, invisible. Inside, he was a warrior, one of thousands who walked silently through the streets of the United States, carrying on their backs an entire world of stolen dreams, of silenced love. And despite everything, Valentine kept going. Always forward. Time isn't measured the same when you live in the shadows. For Valentine, days piled on top of each other, leaving only subtle marks. A new wrinkle on his face, a hair whiter than the last time he looked in a broken mirror. But while he aged without witnesses, Alma flourished. The girl, raised in a basement where light barely entered in thin threads, found her world in books that Valentine got at garage sales or picked up from the sidewalks on bulk trash days. It didn't matter if they were torn, without covers, or stained. Alma hugged them like treasures. She learned to read in Spanish first, spelling out word by word with Valentine's infinite patience, who taught her as he could, between endless work shifts. Each night, after eating the same plate of rice and beans, Valentine would spread a blanket on the floor and, with a flashlight that barely illuminated, read to her. Adventure stories, tales of talking animals, fables of anonymous heroes. He did it with a tenderness that transformed those grey nights into moments of pure magic. Alma listened with bright eyes, as if each word built an entire world where everything was possible. Alma was smart, well above her age. Valentine saw it in the way she asked questions, in her insatiable curiosity, in how she clung to the English language as if it were a rope to climb toward a better future. At 6, she already spoke better English than her father, who remained trapped in the rudimentary Spanglish of hard labor. When the time came to enroll her in school, Valentine trembled. He didn't have a real proof of address, just an address borrowed from an acquaintance who owed him a favor. The day Alma crossed the rusty door of the neighborhood elementary school for the first time, Valentine stayed outside, standing, watching in silence, fighting back tears. He knew that from that moment on, his daughter would begin to walk toward a world where he couldn't fully follow her. The effort bore fruit. Alma wasn't just good in school, she was exceptional. The teacher, a gray-haired lady named Miss Parker, asked to speak with Valentine one day after class. He arrived nervous, with his cap in hand, feeling small before the clean, bright school building. "Your daughter is brilliant," said the teacher with a sweet accent. "She has talent. If she continues like this, she could aspire to a full scholarship in the future." Valentine didn't understand all the words, but he did understand Alma's proud smile. Her small hands clutched to her notebook full of gold stars. He felt lighter, as if for an instant all the pain and misery had been worth it. The basement was still a dark hole, but Valentine began to see it differently. It was no longer just a refuge. It was a seedbed. There, between damp walls and cracked ceilings, something beautiful and powerful was growing: hope. To not hinder Alma's progress, Valentine decided to work even harder. He took night shifts, cleaning offices, so he could be at home when his daughter returned from school. He slept barely 4 or 5 hours a day, ate minimally, but when he saw Alma doing her homework under the trembling light of the flashlight, all the fatigue turned into silent pride. The years passed brutally, taking with them pieces of Valentine's body: his twisted back, his deformed hands, his tired eyes. But they also brought rewards: certificates of excellence, school medals, recognitions that Alma hung with tape on the damp walls of the basement. Each of those awards was a personal victory for Valentine. He didn't understand them all, couldn't pronounce many of the titles given to his daughter, but he knew, deep in his soul, that each paper, each golden ribbon, was one more brick in the bridge he was building for her to cross toward a future that he could never step on. At 14, Alma won her first partial scholarship for a summer program at the county community college. Valentine, who had never gone beyond the 3rd grade of elementary school, walked with her that first day, feeling like a stranger in a world too big and neat for his worn clothes and patched boots. But Alma didn't seem to notice his appearance. She clung to his hand tightly, smiling as if there was no better companion in the world than this small, brown and hunched man who had brought her there with blood, sweat and faith. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered to him in Spanish. "All this is because of you." Valentine didn't respond. He couldn't. The words got stuck in his throat, turned into tears that burned in his eyes, but that, once again, he didn't let fall. He just nodded and squeezed Alma's hand, like someone holding a living miracle. That afternoon, upon returning to the basement, Valentine took out the old cookie tin from under the mattress. He opened it and counted one by one the wrinkled earnings of years of sacrifice. It wasn't much, just a few $100s, but in his mind they were no longer dirty bills, they were wings. Wings that sooner or later would carry Alma toward a sky he would never see, but that he had dreamed of his entire life. Sometimes pain doesn't come from poverty or injustice. It comes from whom you least expect, like a knife that pierces not the body but the soul. Valentine learned that the day he saw his daughter begin to drift away, little by little, like a ship that leaves port without looking back. Alma grew up fast. With her scholarship, she managed to enter a prestigious high school, where students carried new backpacks, wore shining shoes, and spoke perfect English that for Valentine was almost a foreign language. At first, she returned home excited, telling every detail: the new friends, the demanding teachers, the projects that challenged her. Valentine listened with the same silent love as always, though inside he began to feel an unknown twinge, a deaf fear of being left behind. Months passed, and the conversations became briefer. Alma no longer wanted to speak Spanish at home. She grew impatient when Valentine didn't understand some word in English or when he mispronounced something. She laughed nervously, looking around, as if embarrassed by that father who had crossed deserts and collected garbage so she could dream. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but like humidity that slowly filters through walls until breaking them, it ended up opening a painful crack between them. Valentine told himself it was normal, that young people were like that Alma just needed to find her own path. But at night, while dining alone in the cold basement, he couldn't help wondering at what point he had ceased to be her hero to become her burden. Alma met Eric, a young man of American descent, at the university. Eric came from a middle-class family, spoke with confidence, smiled, showing white and orderly teeth. Valentine met him briefly when he went to pick up Alma after a party. Eric's greeting was courteous but distant, like someone who extends a hand to a stranger out of mere obligation. Shortly after, Alma announced she would get married. Valentin remained silent. He had imagined that moment many times, but never so soon. Never with that bitter feeling of not being part of the celebration. The wedding would be simple, they said, just a few friends and close family. Valentin waited for the formal invitation. It never came. The ceremony was small, at a county courthouse. Valentin wasn't invited. He found out about it through a photo on social media, an image where Alma wore simple white, smiling shyly next to Eric, under an improvised arch of plastic flowers. The news that followed the wedding was even more devastating. Eric had helped Alma regularize her immigration status. Finally, his daughter would be an American citizen. For Valentin, who had dreamed for years of that moment for her, it should have been a source of pride. But the way Alma communicated it left a bitter taste in his mouth that he couldn't swallow. One ordinary afternoon, as Valentin was returning from work, his daughter was waiting for him in the basement, sitting in the only decent chair they had. She held a manila envelope in her hands and an expression that Valentin couldn't immediately decipher. "Dad," began Alma, avoiding looking him in the eyes, "Eric and I think that the best for you would be to return to Mexico." The blow was so brutal that Valentin was left breathless for a moment. He didn't understand. He didn't want to understand. "What do you mean?" he managed to murmur, feeling his voice breaking. "It's very dangerous for you here. If immigration finds you, it could be worse," she continued, almost in a whisper. "We want you to be safe. There you could be with your family. Rebuild your life." She took out of the envelope a bus ticket, a one-way passage to Nogales, Sonora. There was also a small envelope with some bills, a ridiculous sum, a few tens of dollars. "We're doing this for your own good," said Alma, rising as if she could no longer bear the conversation a second longer. Valentin didn't respond. He just looked at the ticket and the envelope with money, as if they were objects from another world, pieces of a reality in which he never imagined living. He felt something inside him breaking, something that neither all the physical pain nor all the humiliation suffered had managed to break. Alma left that night. She said goodbye with a quick forced hug, like someone completing an uncomfortable formality. Valentin watched her walk away down the dusty alley with her expensive purse and elegant dress, while he, covered in dust and sweat, stood at the door of the basement that had been his home. That night, for the first time in many years, Valentin cried openly, not like a man, but like a lost child. He cried for everything he had given, for everything he had dreamed, for everything he had sacrificed. And he cried, above all, for understanding that in the end, his love had not been enough to keep his daughter. The bus ticket remained on the table all night, illuminated by the weak light of the flashlight he used to read stories to Alma when she was little. An entire life summarized in a return journey to a place that no longer felt like his own. And Valentin, alone, defeated, without strength to fight, knew he had no choice but to accept it. Valentin got up early the morning of his immigration appointment. The envelope with the notification had arrived days before, without warning, and although his heart suspected something, his mind clung to a naive hope. Maybe it was just a routine update, one more verification in the endless clandestine life he led. He dressed in his only formal shirt, the one he had kept for years for special occasions, and that now hung loose on his thin body. He combed his hair carefully in front of the cracked mirror of the communal bathroom and hugged the old folder where he kept documents, photos of Alma as a child, and some letters he never dared to send. He left the basement, walking slowly, feeling that each step took him away from everything he had built with so much effort. He arrived at the immigration center early. The building was gray, impersonal, full of serious faces and cold walls. He sat in a row of metal chairs, alongside others like him, men and women with tired faces, children who wouldn't stop looking at the floor. elderly people hugging folders as if they were lifesavers. He waited. Hours. When they finally called his name, Valentin rose with difficulty and followed the agent who escorted him, not knowing that there would be no questions, no interviews, no opportunity to explain. Just plastic handcuffs tight on his wrists, dry orders in English he barely understood, and the hollow sound of the metal door closing behind him. The impact of the truth was brutal. He had been reported. Someone had given his name, his address, his immigration status, everything. Valentin felt the blood freezing in his veins. Who? How? Why? In his mind, only one impossible answer could appear. Alma. Hours passed, perhaps days, in cold cells where the lights never went out, where the smell of hopelessness was as dense as the stale air he breathed. They treated him like a criminal. They took away his few belongings, his worn wallet, the folded photos of Alma at 3, 6, and 12 years old. Everything he had left of his life in the United States now rested in a plastic bag with his name misspelled. In the first hours, Valentin thought it was all a mistake. That Alma, upon finding out, would come running, would cry in front of the officers, would explain to them that her father was a good man, an honest worker who never harmed anyone. But days passed, and no one came. He understood then that there was no mistake, that the abandonment had been complete, calculated, silent. The transfer was equally humiliating. Loaded onto a bus with other deportees, handcuffed at feet and hands, escorted as if they were dangerous prisoners. They crossed the border at dawn, without goodbyes, with no more ceremony than a rough push and the order not to return. Valentin stepped onto Mexican soil, not knowing whether to cry or scream. He didn't recognize the dusty streets, the signs in Spanish, the faces of the people. He had spent so long living on the margin of another country that his own place of origin seemed foreign, strange, hostile. With the little money he had hidden in the sole of his shoe, an old trick learned from other migrants, he paid for a night in a miserable shelter. A rusty metal cot, a frayed blanket, and a plate of cold rice. He didn't need more. Hunger was little compared to the emptiness that gnawed at his chest. That night, sitting in a corner of the shelter, he took out the photos of Alma from the plastic bag. His trembling fingers traced the smiling faces of the girl he had held in his arms under the desert sun, of the teenager he had seen shine under the stars in the dusty yard of his basement. The betrayal didn't come from a stranger, it came from his own blood. From the daughter he had promised to protect, feed, educate at the cost of his own life. He tried to find explanations. Maybe Alma was afraid. Maybe Eric had pressured her. Maybe life there had transformed her into someone he no longer knew, but no excuse was enough to justify the cruel abandonment, the anonymous report, the silent exile. Valentin let the photos fall onto the dirty bed. For the first time in many years, he felt something stronger than love, more corrosive than sadness, resentment. Not toward Alma. He couldn't hate her, no matter how much his heart bled. The grudge was toward himself, for having believed that sacrifice was enough to buy loyalty, for not having understood that, in the land of opportunity, sometimes the price of rising was cutting the roots that tie you to the past. Dawn came without Valentin sleeping. He got up from the bed, washed his face in a rusty sink, and looked at himself in the broken mirror. He didn't recognize the man who stared back, a weathered face, sunken eyes, hardened expression. He wasn't the same Valentin who crossed the desert with a child in his arms. That man had died somewhere along the way. The one who remained now was another, one who had lost everything, even the illusion of being necessary to someone. With the few pesos he had left, Valentin took a bus toward the interior of Mexico, to a town where, he had been told, his brother Octavio still lived. He didn't know if he would be well received. He knew nothing. He only knew he couldn't stay there, among dirty shelters and memories that stabbed. As the bus advanced through dusty roads, Valentin closed his eyes. Not to dream, but to no longer see what he had left behind. He no longer had a homeland. He no longer had a daughter. He no longer had a name. He only had a tired body and a life to reinvent amid the ruins. If you're enjoying this story, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. The bus glided slowly along forgotten roads, avoiding potholes and donkeys that crossed unhurriedly. Valentin, seated by the window, watched the passing landscape with glassy eyes, like someone observing a country strange to him, though in some remote corner of his memory it should seem familiar. The dusty green of the hills, the unplastered blockhouses, the improvised taco stands on the corners, everything seemed part of a life that no longer belonged to him. He arrived in San Mateo, a small town in the state of Guanajuato, on a leaden-skied afternoon. He got off the bus with his old backpack hanging from his shoulder, the same one he had used on the desert crossing so many years ago. The heat was dense, mixed with the aroma of wet earth and cheap gasoline. He walked, dragging his feet through the irregular streets, timidly asking for Octavio, his older brother, with whom he hadn't spoken for more than a decade. Some looked at him distrustfully, others with pity. In a town where everyone knew each other, a lost face was like a pebble in a shoe, uncomfortable, suspicious. Finally, a woman in a stained apron pointed him to a house at the end of the street, an old construction with cracked walls and a rusty sheet metal roof. Valentin approached, his heart beating with a mixture of hope and fear. Octavio opened the door with a frown. He had aged badly, a prominent belly, a face weathered by the sun and years, the hard eyes of someone who had learned to survive without expecting anything from anyone. "What are you doing here, Valentin?" he asked without any hint of warmth. Valentin lowered his gaze, feeling that every word he needed to explain got stuck in his throat. "I was deported," he whispered. "I have nowhere to go." Octavio observed him for a few interminable seconds. Finally, he opened the door wide. "Come in." The house was small and disorderly. A single room served as living room, dining room, and bedroom. In one corner, a gas stove barely supported by bricks. In another, a worn-out cot. There were no luxuries, not even basic comforts, but there was a roof. And that, for Valentin, was more than he had had for weeks. Octavio was not a man of words. He indicated with a gesture a corner where he could sleep, and without saying anything else, went back to sitting in front of an old television that barely worked. Valentin left his backpack on the floor and sat in silence, listening to the low hum of the device. The first nights were difficult. There was no space or privacy. Valentin worked at whatever he found, unloading cement bags, cutting undergrowth, repairing half-fallen roofs. The bosses paid him pittances, but he accepted without complaint. After years of hard work in the United States, it was ironic that now, in his own country, his existence was even more precarious. The town had changed. It was no longer the quiet community he remembered from his childhood. Now, violence lurked around corners, drug gangs recruited young people, and people lived in constant fear. Valentin, accustomed to being invisible, quickly learned not to get into trouble, not to look too much, not to ask questions. The central market, where he went to buy the little he could afford, was a mosaic of faces hardened by necessity. Sometimes, while haggling over the price of tortillas or looking for the cheapest fruit, Valentin wondered if there really was a place for him in this Mexico to which he had returned, forced, like a pariah without roots. The nights were the worst. Lying in his corner, looking at the corroded ceiling, Valentin reviewed his life as if leafing through a broken album. He remembered Alma at every stage, crawling in the damp basement, learning to read under the flashlight, winning her first scholarship. Each memory was a lash, each image an open wound that wouldn't close. Sometimes he dreamed of her, dreamed that she came looking for him, that she ran toward him with tears in her eyes, asking for forgiveness. They hugged, and all the pain disappeared. But he would wake up on the cold floor alone, with the echo of his breathing as his only company. Octavio, for his part, asked no questions, nor did he offer consolation. Valentin suspected his brother thought he deserved his fate. After all, who abandons their land, their people, to end up begging for love in a foreign country? Despite everything, Valentin tried not to get lost in self-pity. He forced himself to get up every day, to work, to keep moving. Sometimes, while picking up debris or sweeping forgotten streets, he thought that his existence now was like those bits of trash that the wind dragged from one side to another. Useless, ignored, invisible. But he also knew that somehow he had to find a new purpose. If not for Alma, then for himself, because continuing to live just out of habit was a slow way of dying. The first glimpse of light came in an unexpected way. One morning, while repairing a collapsed fence on the outskirts of town, he heard a familiar voice shout his name. He turned slowly, shielding his eyes from the sun. It was Gale, a young man who, many years ago, had shared the basement with him for a few weeks in Texas. Gale, who had arrived in the United States as just a child, whom Valentin had protected, fed, and consoled when he cried with fear. Gael, now a grown man, with a firm gaze and a smile that hadn't lost its tenderness. "Don Valentin, I've been looking for you." Valentin, incredulous, let the hammer he was holding fall. For a moment, the weight of pain, abandonment, betrayal seemed to lift from his shoulders. He wasn't as alone as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a spark of hope among the ruins. Gael approached Valentin with firm steps, his eyes shining with emotion. He carried a backpack on his shoulder and a jacket worn from the long journey. It was noticeable that he came from far away, with his face toasted by the sun and his voice loaded with contained urgency. "Don Valentin," he repeated, as if he couldn't believe he finally had him in front of him. Valentin, still paralyzed, released the breath he had been holding without realizing it. He wiped his dust-filled hands on his pants and extended his arms. Gale didn't hesitate for a second to hug him tightly, like a son reuniting with his father after a war. The hug was long, awkward, full of words that weren't said but were perfectly understood. When they separated, Valentin barely managed to murmur, "What are you doing here, boy?" Gale smiled, that frank smile he had always had as a child, and said, "I came looking for you. I came to give back a little of what you gave me when I needed it most." Valentin didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to someone, much less a young man, traveling thousands of miles just to see him. He invited him into Octavio's house, where distrustful glances briefly crossed, but where Gale imposed himself with a firm courtesy that disarmed any reluctance. Seated in the old plastic chairs in the yard, under a sun that fell without mercy, Gale told his story. He had managed to finish high school in the United States, worked in construction, saved penny by penny. He had married Isabella, a young Mexican woman of sweet character but indomitable spirit. They couldn't have children, but they had adopted 2 nephews who had been orphaned. "Our family grew," said Gale, smiling with a mixture of pride and tenderness. "And always, always we talked about you, about everything you taught us, not to give up, to work hard, to dream big." He took out of his backpack a folder full of papers, brochures of houses, rental properties. He had planned everything. "We want you to live with us, Don Valentin, not here." He looked around, almost with sadness. "There, in a more peaceful little town. I already have a small house rented, a small piece of land where we can plant. It's not much, but it's ours." Valentin felt a lump in his throat. He didn't understand how, after having been betrayed by his own daughter, life sent him this unexpected redemption through a boy he had barely known for a few months, but whom he had treated as family when he had nothing. Octavio, who listened from the door, said nothing. He just nodded slightly, as if giving his mute blessing for Valentin to undertake the journey. The next day, without looking back, Valentin got into Gael's old truck, and together they set off toward a new destination. The journey was long and bumpy. They crossed dirt roads, dry rivers, hills where goats grazed freely. At each turn, Valentin felt that he left behind a little more of the accumulated pain, as if the wind tore it from his bones. They arrived at a little town lost among mountains, where the streets were of stone, and neighbors still greeted each other with hat in hand. The house that Gael had secured was modest. Whitewashed walls, an old tile roof, a dusty yard where he had already begun to plant flowers. When Valentin crossed the threshold, Isabella welcomed him with a warm hug, and the children ran around him shouting, "Grandpa, Grandpa!" They weren't of his blood, but love doesn't understand lineages. For the first time in a long time, Valentin allowed himself to smile without fear. Days began to have a new rhythm. Each morning, he went out to the yard with Gael to plant corn, water the flowers, repair fences. Isabella prepared hot coffee and freshly made tortillas, and the children filled the house with laughter and races. Valentin, who had learned to survive in silence, began to remember what it was like to truly live. He became the soul of the family. He told them stories under the stars, taught the children to fix things, to plant, to care for animals. Each laugh, each "thank you, Grandpa," each hug from those small arms around his waist was a balm that healed a little more the invisible wounds he had brought in his soul. Although the ghosts of the past still visited him some nights, the memory of Alma, the silent betrayal, the dark basement, Valentin learned to live with them. He didn't offer them a fight, but he didn't allow them to steal the new moments of happiness either. One afternoon, sitting in an old rocking chair that Gael had repaired especially for him, Valentin looked at the orange sky and realized something simple and profound. The family that life denied him in blood, it had given him in gratitude. It wasn't the future he had imagined when he crossed the desert. It wasn't the American dream of big houses and shiny cars. It was something humbler, but infinitely more real. A home where he was loved, respected, and needed. And for a man like Valentin, that was worth more than any document, more than any official recognition. It was, finally, a home. Time, in the new home, passed in a different way. There were no clocks marking impossible obligations or oppressive walls, reminding him of what he had lost. Each day in that small house with old tiles was a silent reconstruction of what Valentin thought he had left behind forever: his dignity. The first months were a mixture of hard work and simple discoveries. Gael, with his inexhaustible energy, drove projects all over the property. They raised a small chicken coop with recycled wood, planted rows of beans and corn, and built an improvised clothesline that danced with the wind. Valentin integrated into each task with a quiet devotion, feeling how each hammer blow, each buried seed, was also a way of planting new dreams in the earth. Isabella, for her part, wove warmth into every corner of the house. She cooked dishes that smelled like home: steaming broths, tamales wrapped in corn husks, thick handmade tortillas. At each meal, Valentin sat at the head of the table like a respected patriarch, surrounded by the cheerful voices of children who, without knowing his whole story, loved him with the absolute innocence of those who don't require proof to give their hearts. The children, Camilla and Emiliano, sought him out from the first day as if they had been waiting for him all their lives. They followed him everywhere, curious, eager to learn. Valentin taught them to plant, to build wooden toys, to recognize constellations in the night sky. He rediscovered in them a tenderness that he had believed lost along with Alma, and almost miraculously, his heart began to heal. The nights became sacred ceremonies. After dinner, they would all sit in the yard, under a sky loaded with stars, while Valentin told stories. They weren't fairy tales or adventures of princes, but accounts of his life, of times on the ranch, of crossing the desert, of the silent struggle in the forgotten basements of the United States. He narrated everything with a soft, unhurried voice, without dramatics like someone watering a plant with patience. Camilla, with her disheveled braids, looked at him with wide eyes, as if each word were a jewel. Emiliano, sitting at his feet, bombarded him with questions. What was it like to sleep under the stars? What does it feel like to walk without knowing if you'll arrive alive? Weren't you afraid to be alone? Valentine smiled with sadness, caressing the children's heads, and always responded with the same teaching. Fear is always there, son, but you learn to walk with it beside you. Little by little, the neighbors also began to know Grandpa Valentine. In a town where everyone knew everything about everyone, his presence didn't go unnoticed, but his humble and hard-working manner earned the respect of the community. They invited him to clean-up tasks, to patron saint festivals, to Sunday markets. He even became friends with Don Rogelio, the town elder, who taught him to build stone fences and graft fruit trees. Together, they spent hours under the sun, working in silence, sharing that wisdom that only those who have lived a lot understand without needing many words. Valentine, who had been a ghost for years, began to feel seen again. And more importantly, he began to feel useful again. One day, Gael came home with a surprise. He had arranged, thanks to some savings and help from the community, for Valentine to be in charge of a small communal plot. It would be his responsibility to care for the crops, organize the plantings, and distribute the harvest among the town's families. Valentine couldn't contain the tears when he received the news. It wasn't just a piece of land. It was a second chance, a silent recognition of his worth, his effort, his story. Thus, among furrows and seeds, Valentine began his true rebirth. Each dawn, he went out to the field with a light heart, feeling the dew on his face, the smell of wet earth, the song of roosters. He worked the land like someone writing a love letter to the future, with weathered hands but a clean soul. When evening came, he returned home with arms loaded with fruits and a spirit full of gratitude. He found Isabella preparing coffee, the children running through the yard, Gael fixing the fence or painting the windows. And in each of these small moments, Valentine found a serene, simple happiness that didn't depend on papers or bright cities or broken promises. He had understood, at last, that home is not a geographical place. It's not a flag or a document. Home is where love receives you without asking for anything in return. It's where your wounds are seen, but not judged. It's where, after all the pain, you can become who you really are again. That night, as the wind whispered among the tree branches, Valentine lay down in his improvised hammock in the yard and looked at the stars. He thought of Alma, of everything he had lost, of everything he had dreamed for her. There was no hate in his heart, just a resigned sadness and at the same time a new, deep peace. Because in that forgotten corner of the world, with a family that life had given him instead of the blood that had denied him, Valentine had found what he had always sought, a place to start over, a place where, at last, he could rest. Life has silent ways of settling accounts, and for Alma the settlement came in a banal instant while she absently slid her finger across her cell phone screen. It was just another afternoon in Los Angeles. Alma, now an American citizen, worked in an elegant office of mirrored glass, wore designer clothes, and drove a latest model car. She had achieved everything she once dreamed of: stability, respect, belonging. However, there was a latent discomfort inside her, something that neither luxuries nor social recognition could erase. She didn't think much about Valentine. Occasionally, his face fleetingly crossed her mind, but she quickly found an excuse to push it away. It was better this way, she told herself. He would be fine. Surely he had found his way in Mexico. Maybe he had even rebuilt his life. But that afternoon, Without looking for it, an image appeared before her on social media. Someone from the town where her husband lived had shared a photograph. A group of children playing in a yard full of flowers, a grey-haired man sitting in a hammock, laughing with them. It was Valentine, her father, smiling in a way that Alma didn't remember having seen since she was a child. The blow was devastating, her vision blurred. The cell phone fell from her hands, crashing against the carpeted floor of the office. A sharp buzz filled her ears as guilt, dormant for so long, awoke like a hungry beast within her. She ran to the nearest bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and let the tears repressed for years flow uncontrollably. She couldn't stop them, didn't want to stop them. Each sob was a mute confession of everything she had buried under layers of pride and self-deception. She remembered the last time she saw her father. His hunched figure, his worn clothes, the envelope with the bus ticket that she herself had left on the table. The image of Valentine, alone, standing in the alley while she walked away without looking back, pierced her like a dagger. How could she have betrayed him like that? How could she have forgotten everything he sacrificed for her, in her rush to fit into a world that had taught her to be ashamed of her roots? Alma had torn away not only her origins, but also the only person who loved her unconditionally. That night she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, feeling the weight of remorse crushing her. Every achievement, every diploma, every award she had won now seemed dirty to her, contaminated by the betrayal that sustained them. Finally, in a desperate impulse, she booked a flight to Mexico. She didn't notify her husband, didn't plan anything. She just packed a small suitcase, took her passport, and set off to meet her past. The journey was long, full of external and internal turbulence. As the plane flew over unknown lands, Alma reviewed everything she wanted to say, but no words seemed sufficient to heal the abyss she had opened. She arrived in the small town at sunset. The taxi left her in the main square, where children played in the fountain and elderly people gathered on benches to comment on the day's news. People looked at her with curiosity, with that mixture of welcome and distrust reserved for outsiders. She asked for Valentine. No more needed to be said. The neighbors smiled and pointed to an alley of irregular stones that wound toward the outskirts of town. Alma walked, trembling, with her heart beating in her throat. When she arrived, she saw him. Valentine was sitting in the hammock under the shade of a mango tree, gently swinging, while two small children asked him animated questions. He looked so different. Older, yes, but also more serene, more at peace than ever. Alma stopped several yards away, unable to approach. She didn't know how to interrupt that scene of simple happiness that she herself had denied years ago. Isabella, who was coming out of the house with a tray of lemonade, saw her first. She approached slowly, measuring the tension in the air. "Are you Alma?" she asked softly. Alma nodded, unable to speak. Isabella said nothing more. She just indicated with a gesture that she should wait. It was Gael who approached Valentine and whispered something in his ear. Valentine remained motionless for a few seconds, then slowly turned his head until his eyes met Alma's. Time seemed to stop. Alma wanted to run to him, hug him, cry on his chest like when she was a child, but her legs wouldn't respond, and Valentine, from his hammock, made no gesture to approach. He merely looked at her, a long, deep look, full of a serene sadness that said more than any word. Alma took a step forward, then another. Her lips trembled. "Dad," she whispered, breaking down. "Forgive me, please." Valentine observed her without resentment, but also without the tenderness of before. In his face there was no hatred, only an infinite weariness, the weariness of someone who has cried all their tears and expects nothing more. Gael, understanding the weight of the moment, took the children inside. Isabella also withdrew discreetly, leaving them alone under the dying sky of the afternoon. Alma knelt before Valentine, crying uncontrollably. "I didn't know. I didn't understand. "I was a fool, Dad. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Valentine let her talk. He didn't interrupt her laments. He let her empty herself completely, like someone who allows a storm to pass without resisting. When Alma, exhausted, looked up, Valentine finally spoke, with a soft voice, rough as stone, polished by life. "I already forgave you, Alma, a long time ago." Alma sobbed even harder, feeling the weight of remorse crushing her against the ground. But something in Valentine's tone, in his serene gaze, made it clear to her that although forgiveness had been granted, the wounds of the past could not be erased. There was forgiveness, yes, but the lost time, would never return. The following days were a fragile balance between past and present. Alma decided to stay in the town for a few weeks, trying in her way to repair the irreparable. She helped Isabella in the kitchen, accompanied the children to pick fruits, and followed Valentine in the field chores, though he rarely said anything. Her presence was accepted but not sought. It was as if she were walking on the ruins of a bridge that she had demolished with her own hands. Each gesture of kindness, each word of gratitude, each shared silence was one more brick in the attempt at reconstruction. But Alma knew, with a bitter twinge, that some things would never be as before. Valentine, for his part, held no resentment. He had left that weight long ago, buried in the cold nights of the shelters and in the lonely dawns of the field. His heart had learned not to cling to what hurt him. He had learned to be grateful for what he had, without demanding explanations from fate. He continued living his routine with serenity, planting, teaching the children, fixing what others gave up for lost. Each small act was a silent affirmation of his decision not to let himself be defined by abandonment, but by the love he had chosen to sow without expecting any harvest. In the afternoons, the yard filled with life. Camilla and Emiliano played around him, while Isabella and Gael prepared homemade bread and chatted about plans to expand the house. Alma observed everything with a lump in her throat. She was witnessing a world she didn't know, a world that her father had built without her, where she was no longer indispensable, where her absence had been overcome. However, amid that sadness, Alma also began to understand something fundamental. True love holds no grudges or demands returns. Valentine didn't need her to apologize over and over. He didn't need her to crawl in her remorse. All he ever wanted was her happiness, even if that meant following separate paths. One Sunday, as the sun set over the golden fields, Valentine organized a lunch under the old mango tree. It was a simple meal, refried beans, rice, corn tortillas, and a huge pitcher of hibiscus water. But for those who sat at that improvised table, it was a feast full of meaning. Before beginning, Valentine raised his clay cup. "To family," he said simply, "the one you choose, the one you build, the one that never abandons you, even if life pushes you far away." Everyone raised their cups too, moved. Even Alma, who couldn't help tears blurring her vision. That day, something settled inside her. She understood that she could never undo the damage, but that she could still honor the love that her father had sown in her. Not with words, but with acts, with presence, with humility. In the days that followed, Alma dedicated herself to really helping. She fixed the roof of the little house, installed a safer water connection, bought books for the children, not as a way to redeem herself, but as a sincere gesture of love. Valentine observed everything in silence, with a calm smile. He had learned not to expect miracles. He was content with small gestures, with sincere presences, with the seeds of kindness that finally flourished in the most unexpected terrain. The time came when Alma had to return to Los Angeles. Her life was there, her work, her commitments. But this time, the farewell was different. There were no rushes, no uncomfortable silences. They hugged for a long time, strongly, under the same tree where Valentine had been reborn. "Thank you, Dad," whispered Alma in his ear. "Thank you for never giving up on me." Valentine gently stroked her back, as when she was a child frightened by storms. "Go in peace, my daughter. Here you will always have your home." And with that silent blessing, Alma left, carrying with her the certainty that true love, although mistreated, although ignored, never dies completely. The years continued to pass, as they tend to do in towns where time seems to walk barefoot. Valentine aged in peace. His hair turned completely white, his walk slower, but his spirit remained strong. The children grew up calling him Grandpa, with a pride that knew no blood or documents. Gael and Isabella became his daily support, his chosen family. Each afternoon, Valentine sat in his hammock, looking at the horizon where the sun was lost behind the planted fields. Sometimes he received letters from Alma, short but sincere, full of news and affection. He didn't always answer. There was no need. He knew she carried him in her heart, even if they were far apart. The pain of betrayal no longer hurt as before. It was an old scar, a mark of a battle he had fought and overcome. Now, his life was full of daily small miracles. The first grain of corn from the harvest, Emiliano's laughter when he caught a cricket, the smell of freshly baked bread on Sundays. And in those simple moments, Valentine understood that he had lived a valuable life. Not a perfect life, not a fairy tale life, but a life of love sown with hands and watered with true tears. Because whoever sows love, sooner or later, harvests love. And Valentine, in his silent and brave way, had harvested more than he ever imagined. He had found his home, he had found his family, he had found finally his peace. And if you liked this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like and turn on notifications. Until next time.